from the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum. With your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
I am most pleased to welcome you to our program. On our program today, we are going to talk about a very important subject, strategies for conflict resolution in the workplace. We're very pleased to have our guest, Betsy T. Hawkins. She is the Director of Human Resources at the Kootenai Medical Center in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Our guest holds a BA degree in Health Services Administration and Labor Relations from Eastern Washington University. She's also done graduate studies in guidance and counseling. I want to add a footnote and say Betsy and her family were one of the first families that I met years ago, and I moved to Coeur d'Alene, and she's family to us. And so, Betsy, thank you for being so kind as to come and talk about a really important topic. And I know you do workshops. In fact, I was talking recently to someone, and they just praised how wonderful it went. So thank you for being here, and let's get right into our subject.
Thank you, Tony. It's my pleasure.
As always, I'm pleased to have our regular panelist, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and we shall ask Janelle to commence today's questioning.
Thank you. Betsy, one of the most important places that we are is our workplace. We spend a lot of time there, and it's very important to us. How often is there conflict in the workplace? And if so, what are the major causes?
Well, I think conflict is just a nature of the workplace. And there's going to be a variety of different types of conflict. There's going to be interpersonal conflict and conflict of priorities and a lot of different conflict. The most problematic is probably interpersonal conflict, and it occurs between employees, and it occurs between employees and supervisors, and it occurs all the time.
What is it the result of? What causes it to bubble up and come to the forefront?
Well, I think it's somewhat complicated in the sense that conflict occurs for a number of different reasons. Recent studies have shown that change, just the nature of change in the workplace, and as you know, the workplace is changing dramatically, creates conflict. As conflict increases, employees have a higher need for communication and information, and things break down in chaos and change. But I think that one of the things that I see and observe and personally experience that we often have conflict because in the workplace we have our friends. At my job, we call ourselves our work family, and we spend more time at work than oftentimes we spend with our family. And so with that, we get confused sometimes. There's different relationships. There's friend relationships, there's peer relationships, there's boss relationships, there's peer relationships. So if we're not clear about the purpose of those relationships, it can create conflict by the very nature that we're not clear with one another about why the relationships exist.
At the risk, Tony, if I may, just asking one more question. When this happens, when you're not clear about what your role is or what your relationship is with another person, be it a supervisor or coworker or even someone that you are supervising, what can be done about that to clarify, to make things clearer?
Well, I think with conflict, one of the mistakes that we make is that conflict creates fear. If you ask anybody about why they don't deal with conflict in the workplace or conflict with another individual, they're often very much afraid. And they're afraid, the number one reason I hear is that they don't want to hurt another individual. They don't want to hurt the relationship. And I think one of the first things that we need to make or help people understand is that the first insight with conflict is seeing the value of it and talking about it openly, and to clarify the purpose of why you're afraid, and to just create some dialogue about it. Make it okay to talk about it. I think that would be a wonderful insight and a wonderful thing to see.
In introducing you, I did not make the point that you have almost 1,000 employees, just a little under that.
Oh, no, we have more than that now.
Now
we have almost 1,400 employees.
Oh, because on the data I had was outdated.
We're growing by leaps and bounds.
Yes, so we're 1,400 employees in a multi-million-dollar, of course, operation. So you have people, obviously, in your business around the clock, different shifts. How does one deal with conflict in relation to personalities? I'm thinking of several things. with that many employees, you have people coming from many different backgrounds. Some people really will go to great lengths to avoid conflict. They don't like it. It's very uncomfortable. And others seem to really enjoy a more aggressive approach. And in the workshops you do, and of course in your daily work that you have at the center, how do you implement within your program ideas that can accommodate these different personalities?
Well, I think one thing we do at Kootenai Medical Center that I'm particularly proud about is that we try to create a little bit of maturity around conflict. People are taught from a very young age how to deal with conflict, and I guess what I'm saying is they're not taught. And so we get into unhealthy modes. We call it the silence violence, that people either retreat or they attack. And we call it the bitching, backbiting, bemoaning response. We've implemented a conflict resolution or interpersonal norm that we call it commitment to coworker, that we will make a commitment to you to work out our problems one-on-one. And I think that Kootenai has made huge strides in hiring people and communicating that norm right from the get-go when they get hired, that they're going to work together as a team, and part of that is making a commitment to each other to work out the conflict. And that doesn't solve all the problems, but at least right from the very beginning, it creates an expectation around our corporate and organizational ethics about how we work through conflict. And I think that's been very helpful because it helps us create permission to actively and openly encourage people to resolve the conflict. The second thing we've done is we've educated through my workshops, of course, and through other means, bringing in speakers and consultants, because we understand that if we focus on interpersonal conflict and we work better together, that our teamwork and our productivity increases, and ultimately it's for the benefit of what we do and our mission as in an organization. So we're pretty clear that if our employees are working better together, that our patients are better served. And we believe and see that every day.
I'd like for you to just for a moment take a list of things that can cause conflict to arise in an individual and therefore at the workplace. I'm thinking of maybe what's happening at home, and in your field there's a lot of stress because of patients that are very, in some cases, very ill. What have you discovered in your work that some of it's work related, but is some of it also brought to the job?
Well, I think conflict comes from the very nature of our business. I think it's hard, but I would not be one to say that healthcare is the only difficult industry. I think it's pretty tough in the workplace right now. There's lots of demands financially, emotionally. I was listening to a program the other day, and a 13-year-old said stress really is a combination of time management and expectation, or lack of it. And I thought that was a wise 13-year-old, because I think a lot of our problems right now is we don't have enough time and we have high expectations of each other and ourselves. I think that, though, to back up, that the individual response to conflict has probably been my biggest lesson. It's unresolved conflict that causes the violence in this world, from locally in terms of between two people, between countries, between political parties even, or between countries. And so my feeling is that we need to look inwardly and ask ourselves, we're a part of every conflict. And I think that on an individual basis, you have to assume responsibility. For the most part, I choose not to see us as a victim villain mentality around conflict. And yet often conflict creates that. Someone's being the victim and someone's being the villain. And I think that if we can change our perspective about that and see our own role in that, we can't change the other person. We can only choose to change our response to it. And that's one thing I think that I practice that all the time. I'm not an expert at that. I always tell people I'm a student of conflict, because it's practicing that perspective, it's hard to master.
Janelle Berg.
You've indicated that conflict can be used to improve relationships, and you also have stated that there are 3 insights and a skill. You sort of teach it in that way. Can you tell us what those 3 insights are?
Well, from my own personal experience, I think that the first insight is to see the value of conflict. And that's where, if you ask yourself this question, if you ask yourself, look around you and identify the strongest relationships that you have in your life, whether it be your husband, your wife, your best friend, your boss, ask yourself if there's been free of conflict. For the most part, when I ask that question, people say, no, there's been conflict there, and they've worked through it, and it's strengthened the relationship. And I think that that's the value of conflict. It can often create a cohesiveness and an understanding, and a higher understanding of yourself as well as the other person. I think the second insight I've learned is that in conflict we need to seek the truth. I think that oftentimes we often think it's the truth, but and I also know that humans often make up the truth when they don't know the truth. But if we can approach conflict in a way that we really are seeking the truth about the other individual and about ourselves, and from my experience, you have to start with yourself, and you have to ask yourself, what are you contributing to the conflict? My own personal experience is when I'm contributing to conflict, it's because I'm blind about it. I have a saying, a friend of mine shared with me, that if one person says you're a duck, you can ignore them. But if two people say you're a duck, then you need to check your hiney for tail feathers. And I think that that's particularly true in conflict. And a third insight is one of clear intent. When people are really clear with each other about what they want to see. And I do a lot of conflict resolution, so when I bring people to the table, I ask them, are you committed to each other to work this out? Not to meet your own agenda or something that you have a preconceived idea, but really truly seek the truth and commit to improving the relationship and be clear about that intention. I see that conflict often disappears immediately and we get to the underlying issues between the two individuals. And it's really it's very cool, very great.
Now there's a skill that's required to all of this too. And what's that skill?
Well, I call it, there's Peter Senge wrote in The Fifth Discipline, which is a great book, especially for businesses or anybody that's read anything that has great insight regarding being effective and learning in the workplace. I think that's a great book. And in that book, there's a concept called advocacy and inquiry. And I say that, and it's about creating quality communications. Advocacy is when you advocate for your position, and inquiry is when you're trying to understand the other person's position. And I think in this day and age, we're very good at advocating our position, and we're taught how to articulate that. But I'm not sure that we're taught very well on how to inquire into another person's thoughts and feelings and to truly make the other person feel understood. Another favorite saying of mine is Peter Covey's, I think it was Stephen Covey said, when a person feels misunderstood, it's like being in a room without air. And in conflict, that is particularly true. So if you can make the other person feel understood and teach that skill of inquiry, it brings in a breath of fresh air, and it creates the space to talk and to communicate and to get to the underlying issues.
So basically you're saying a lot of listening.
A lot of listening. But when I use the word listening, people often turn it off. So I use the word inquiry so they can understand and have a different picture in their head about what I'm asking them to do, which is really ask questions and inquire and fully understand. Listening sometimes has its own, a lot of baggage to that word. And so I choose to use the word inquiry to broaden someone's visual thought about what it could look like.
Your comments about conflict, and also very constructive things happen. People do have disagreements, and from that they can get creative ways to not only solve that temporary conflict, but also affect the institution. I'll reverse that to the other side of the coin. Can an organization become so broiled in conflict that the institution's in deep trouble? It's like a family becoming dysfunctional. What are some of the danger signs of, particularly if it's an organization that does not have someone like yourself that works with the employees on conflict resolution? Is there a danger there that it can? You've already mentioned the fact that things lead to violence, as you see, like between nation states and those kind of things.
Yeah, I've seen it happen. It's it's very sad. I think that there is everyday conflict that most people can cope with and deal with. And then I think of a second stage where it's rough enough that you might that you need to really focus in on the conflict, try to resolve it, becomes problematic. The third stage is what I call the full-blown war, and that is usually conflict characterized in interpersonal relationship is usually prior to a marriage breakdown. That's when you need marriage counseling. In businesses and organizations, you need mediation, someone skilled to come in, a third party. I've seen organizations willing to do that, but I don't feel that the process of conflict, whether it's the day-to-day conflict that most people can cope with, to what I call stage 2 conflict, which is a little bit more intense and uncomfortable, and one that it needs to have some problem solving in the third stage, which is requires third-party mediation. That process doesn't change whether it's interpersonal or whether it's organizational. It's the same. So if organizations are really serious about fixing it, they'll bring somebody in to help fix it, mediators. And I've seen that a couple different times. Oftentimes, though, you have to have a willingness at the leadership level to do the outside work first, to look inside themselves, to ask themselves really honestly and clearly what it is that they're doing to contribute to that. And when that happens, those two things, bringing an outside person to help facilitate it, and having the leadership of that organization, whether it's in a marriage institution, it's usually the mom and dad, and in an organization, it's the leadership. If they're willing to do that inside-outside work, I've seen it be successful. But those two things have to be there.
And in the case where they aren't, when one party is just absolutely not willing to discuss or inquire or negotiate, then at that point, and if it's in an organization with other employees affected, is sometimes the only resolution that is for someone to leave the organization.
Yeah, break up. The organization can leave, or in some cases in family businesses, the business actually breaks up. We have to accept sometimes that people don't want to play. And that's true in conflict resolution as well as in relationships. And so oftentimes for their own reasons and for their own purposes, they may choose not to play. And so because of that, you can't force someone to participate in the process.
Janelle Bird.
I'd like to talk about some of the reactions that people have when there's conflict. What are some of the most common reactions that you see? I think you've brushed on that, but could you flesh that out for us a little bit more? For example, the silence, where the person just goes off and withdraws. They really don't want to face the conflict at all. What happens?
Well, in silence, there's a number of different ways that conflict creates silence. One is it disengages people from work. And so what happens is it's the duck and hide syndrome. People don't engage. They don't commit to the service. They don't go for lunches. They only do what's minimally necessary. I had a consultant recently come to Kootenai Medical Center and talk about the hog, feed the hog. He spoke about an incident in which there was such an abusive work environment in a mill that in order to overcome that abuse, they basically fed good lumber into the big hot auger that auged up the lumber. So oftentimes you'll even have sabotage in work because of unresolved conflict and anger. Employees will always act out their anger. If it's not discussed or expressed, they'll act it out. What's not talked out will be acted out. And they'll act it out in either disengaging, maybe minor sabotage, not showing up, sickness, not really caring. And so it's always going to come out. It's just, do you want to deal with it in a healthy way, or do you want it to be acted out? And I always advise people to talk it out.
And then there's the violence, a violent reaction sometimes. And can you talk about that a little bit? Well,
I think you've read a lot in the papers recently about the increase in workplace violence. And again, I think that's unresolved conflict and unwillingness sometimes for employers not to deal with that in an open way. Unfortunately, it's going to happen. And again, we don't teach people at a very basic level on how to do that inside-outside work first. And it's something that we need to give people permission and create an environment where people are safe to explore issues of conflict. I think employers could do much more around that.
Along that line, how important is the supervisor to the kind of environment that they create in the workplace for their employees?
I use the analogy that supervisor is as important as a parent to a child. And I don't mean that to imply that the supervisor is a parent, because I don't think that's healthy. But in terms of the structure of an organization, studies have shown that the quality of the relationship between a supervisor and the employee drives employee satisfaction. It drives outcomes of service. It drives teamwork. There's been tons of I can't speak to all of them, but it is that quality of that relationship that drives the quality of the relationships within the workplace. And I believe that that's a good place to start.
So the supervisor sets the tone.
Absolutely.
In dealing with the conflict with all your years' experience of working with so many people, and the present over 1,400, can you give us somewhat of a list of some of the things that cause conflict the most, that needs attention? And I guess I'm trying to ask a question about warning signs.
That's a good question. I think that often in many cultures, and kind of referring back to an earlier question about the purpose of relationships, I think that one of the warning signs on conflict is you could look for it in morale problems, unresolved morale problems. You could look for it in through employee satisfaction surveys, of course. But one thing that I look for is ask the supervisor to just look at people in terms of their behavior. Are they taking breaks together? Are they talking together? Are they speaking with respect with one another? Healthy interpersonal behaviors are self-evident. Unfortunately, we often turn a blind eye to interpersonal problems. We give excuses and we don't deal with it head on because of our own fears. And one of the things a supervisor can do that I think is effective is talk to employees about the purpose of their work relationship. The purpose of a work relationship is to get to work done. The purpose of a friend relationship is to give each other support, not just at work but outside of work. And that sometimes we get those things mixed up and we don't articulate that. So when you see friendships break down or people are avoiding each other, I really ask that the supervisors get involved and just ask the question. Don't be afraid. We often don't want to interfere or are afraid that we may make things worse. But the truth is, bringing it out in the open and exposing it to light is often the best way to handle it.
Sometimes what the individual needs is just to be heard. That is, we call it venting.
They need to be heard. They need to be recognized. I'm working with just this week with 4 or 5 different situations, both at Kootenai and outside of work. And in every one of those cases, it doesn't appear that the supervisor is aware of what's going on or is choosing to ignore it or hope that it goes away. And I don't think that they do that because they don't want to deal with it. It's just that they just don't know if they're going to make it. Well, I think it's an issue of wanting and being afraid of it.
Or maybe not having the tools and how to
and
deal
the
with
skills. It's fear. A lot of it is fear. And my feeling is if you can face the fear and walk through it, it's taking the Band-Aid off quick. Do you want it to fester and go over a long period of time, or do you want to take the Band-Aid off quick and deal with it quickly?
In the materials that you use in your workshop, I noticed that there was a comment concerning a particular conflict, whether one takes it very serious or not. If you would address that question, an individual may find a situation that is for that person very serious. Maybe a supervisor, someone else, almost laughs it off and says, that's not significant. I suppose that would be a bad approach.
Well, I think that one thing that I see supervisors do is 3 mistakes. And one is that they fail to recognize the issue of power in conflict. Oftentimes, and the one thing that I feel even as a supervisor is that we fail to recognize our positional power. We are supervisors, and positional power does not create safety for for supervisors to be approached about conflict and work out conflict. And so when we fail to recognize positional power, that's one mistake. The second mistake is we hear a problem and we minimize it. We don't think it's that big of a deal. And when we do that, we create a different kind of different kind of power, is that I'm smarter than you. That's not important. And people will often just not approach it again, and we've lost an opportunity. So oftentimes, different kinds of power, or an unawareness of our own personal power, your positional power, your knowledge power, your personal power, that unawareness of that. Humans, for the most part, do not want to see themselves as better than another person. They don't want to recognize their own power. And it's been my experience in working with the issue of power and how that affects conflict, is that I have a hard time getting people to really look at their own power and how it contributes, whether it's positional power as a supervisor or their own personality and their own personal power in the situation. And if you can create awareness in that as an individual, recognize it, it becomes less of an impact. Even talking from my own experience as a human resource director, I used to be very unaware. I don't see myself as a strong, powerful person. And when I did not recognize that in myself, what I ended up doing is carrying it around like an unwieldy stick, hitting people over the head with it. And luckily, I had peers in my organization that brought that to my attention and helped me recognize for myself that I needed to really recognize my own positional power, my personal power, so I could address it, embrace it, and then let it help me and not hurt me.
So unawareness can be a problem too.
Oh, huge.
On that note, I have to bring the program to conclusion. On behalf of Janelle Burke and our staff, I want to thank you very much, Betsy Hawkins, for being with us and talking about conflict in the workplace. It was most informative, and we're grateful that you were here. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take this opportunity to express to our crew, which is a very special group, our thanks and appreciation. We're doing this program, taping it on a Friday evening, and they gave up their time to do that, and we're very grateful to them. They're a very dedicated crew, and we appreciate them very much. I would invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, when we will discuss yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.